Hey, how you doing, brother?
How you doing, man? Good to see you.
Yeah, what's happening? How's your morning so far? It is still morning, correct?
It is still morning. It's 10 o'clock here in the morning, and it was cold and icy here this morning. How about where you are?
Yeah, same in South Africa. I keep telling people it's global warming on steroids. You never know what to expect. You never know what to expect. You wake up in the morning, it's raining, it's cold, then the sun is out, then it's raining and cold again.
Yep, yep,
Yeah,
yep.
yeah,
We're
yeah.
about to we're about to come out of our version of winter here into what we affectionately call the mud season, which is about a
Okay.
solid month of everything thawing out and being brown before it gets green. So good
The
times.
mud season. The mud season. I've just learned something new today.
Yeah.
So, what's the average morning for an award winning author?
Well, I still have a day job, being as you can see behind me. So the average morning for me, I run a city here in northern British Columbia, so that's my gig. So my average day is whatever has landed on my desk that no one else was able to solve. So the only stuff that hits my desk are problems that weren't solved before they get here, and that can be any number of things from public safety issues to infrastructure failure to stuff we want to move forward to new developments in the city, and it could be any number of things. So it's never boring.
Yeah,
It's,
yeah, yeah.
it's always interesting and it's always different and it's often highly entertaining.
Yeah, I can imagine. Huh? Well, at least you don't have an average, normal, boring day.
No, no, no day is ever the
That's a
same.
good
Yeah,
one. Well, before we get to how you fit that into, also being an award winning author, I mean, let's start at day one. How did it all start for you? Your creative journey.
yeah.
That'll be like a great starting point.
Do you want me to dive in now just on that massive question?
Yeah, let's go back as far as you want to go. When are we going back to school? Is that when your
Yep.
writing journey actually started? For bulk of the authors that actually come on, their journey started off like late in their life, like their 30s, 40s. So
Yeah.
how did it start for you?
Mine started early. So I started writing when I was 12. So and the reason why I did that was I was just getting too old to play with action figures, and I had a lot of stories in my head that I wanted to get down. I wanted to write and to keep going with, but I was quickly becoming a teenager, and so my priorities changed, and I didn't have money for anything else back in those days. Like it never occurred to me to go out and get a video camera and make movies. Like I wouldn't even have known where to begin. I had no ability to code or to animate or to draw, but I could write. So that's where I started. It was cheap. All you need is a pencil and a piece of paper or a word processor, and you can kind of get
Yeah, yeah,
started. So it started there. It became a passion very, very quickly. I love the ability to escape. And then as I got into my late teens, I started working, moved out like most people do, paying rent, living your life, all those types of things with various jobs, and then decided that ultimately I still wanted to write. I wanted to be a novelist at some point in my life, but you can't. It's hard to make a go of that in Canada. Like it's not a massive market, and most authors in this country are starving authors, or like me, have a full time job. And so I thought the smart thing to do would be to go and get into a career that was writing based. And so I went and got a journalism degree and became a journalist. And that was sort of my first career after university. And the hope was that that would turn me into somehow I would meet publishers and write novels. And it didn't work that way at all. media,
yeah.
media, media doesn't really lead to being a novelist. At least it didn't in my case. It led to a whole bunch of other things. It led to public relations and communications, and then eventually public administration, running organizations, which has been really, really, really awesome. Like I love my day job, but what never went away was my desire to still be a novelist. Like that is it.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so probably 5, 6 years ago, I started to get more serious about it. I was a little bit older. and started to disappear at nights downstairs to start learning how to write stories better than I had previously. And I found that, writing fiction is a lot different than writing corporate reports or writing communications or journalism. You borrow some skills, but a lot of it is very, very different. So I felt like I had to go back to school to learn how to write creatively. So I took some online courses and read a lot, studied a lot, and then just started and haven't stopped ever since.
Yeah. So, two questions based on what you just said. Uh, like, what sort of content were you writing, in your, 12 years old? Can't
Yeah,
even say teens yet. What sort of content did you start writing with?
yeah, it was fantasy is where I started. I mean, my passion, my home base, I guess you could say, as a reader, is high fantasy. And I'm a big fan of like Dungeons and Dragons books, and of course all the classic like Tolkien and C.S. Lewis and Sword of Shannara and Wheel of Time and all kinds of stuff. So I started in fantasy, but what I found was in fantasy, I like the darker side of things. I like the monsters. I like the creatures.
Yeah.
I like that side of it. And that lent itself eventually to horror. And that's where I've primarily been writing as a fiction writer for the last number of years, is in that genre, which I love. And so horror came to me, a little after fantasy, but it's a passion as well. And so, you can probably guess Halloween. I don't know if you guys celebrate Halloween in South Africa, but it's a big deal in Canada. And for us in our house, it lasts like a month. So like
Yeah.
it's a whole thing.
Well, you my type of creative. I'm also a huge fan of horror.
Oh, okay,
Huge.
right on.
Yeah. Huge fan of horror. From movies to books,
Yeah,
more movies, but I'm also a huge fan of horror. You mentioned a word, escape, and why I want to
yeah,
touch on this. Like, I was on a podcast yesterday, but the tables were reversed.
yeah,
So I was actually, getting interviewed. And I told the host that I used to use music at that age to escape. And then one of the questions she asked me is, what were you escaping from? So when you say you were writing to escape, you want to share a bit on like what were you escaping from?
yeah. That's a big question. I think I was escaping from a number of things. In my life. I think I grew up in a tough household. My mom was a single parent. My dad wasn't around a lot. My brother, who's my best friend now, we were not friendly when we were kids for the most part. It was pretty hard on everybody, but myself included. And we grew up in a rough neighborhood without a lot of money. Where I guess in some parts of the world, it's reasonable to dream that you'll go to university, that you could be a lawyer, that you could be an engineer or whatever, or a doctor. That was not the circumstances that I grew up in. The circumstances I grew up in were, just try to graduate high school and get a job, right? Like it wasn't there. We weren't shooting for the stars. Stay out of jail, was kind of what
Yeah,
I
yeah,
heard when I saw my father, right? Like, he was a good man, but that was, it was, the bar was pretty low. And I think that, for me, I'm naturally a very imaginative and creative person. And so I think sometimes the escape comes from bad things, but it also can come from good things too. Like there was definitely that side of it that drove my desire to escape into other places. But there was also an imagination and a freedom that I had as a child that also fostered that. That also came out of the circumstances under which I grew up. My mom was always big on movies and books and making sure that we got to get out and have adventures and to sort of spark the imagination. And she was always very, very supportive of that. And so that also sort of led me down a road that allowed me to dream in story form and create things in my head. And so I think those two things together became that desire for escapism,
yeah,
which
yeah.
today, like, I'm 40 now, like, it's still there. It's not any weaker. Like, I want to lose myself in a movie, in a show, in a book, in music, whatever it is, right?
it takes you to another world.
It
You
takes you to
know,
another
it really
place.
does
Yeah,
take you to another world.
yeah,
You
yeah,
know, no, but 100%, I get where you're coming from. I mean, speaking about it, you see these sort of stories actually happening in movies. Where someone is coming, from an area where, look, can I go to university? Can I make something of my life? It seems so far fetched, like it's a
yeah,
stretch. It's a
yeah,
real stretch. And I've seen in so many movies myself, talented creators who are just, you know, writing, whereas the lyrics, with this aspiration to become a musician, or, writing like yourself to become an author, hoping one day that, will take them somewhere.
yeah,
We still see it happening in
yeah,
communities. And I mean, the foundation of this podcast was, for that class of people, to give them this sort of education that they can find online, or consult with, like, okay, my personal capacity, consult with me personally on how, I can transform your mindset to keep up with your creative work, to make it
yeah,
something one day, to
yeah,
focus on those communities. Because even in 2025, and I honestly don't think it's South Africa alone, the lower class is still battling with the basics,
yeah,
to maintain their creativity. I mean, down to not having, sufficient network, not having the funds available for
yeah,
data,
yeah,
the infrastructure is just crap,
yeah,
yet they're talented. So it's like such a stretch, can I really do it? Can I really make it?
yeah.
So, yeah, I feel you, man. I really do
Yeah,
feel
yeah, yeah. I'm glad you said that because like it is. There's so many things that go into that, right? Like where you're born, where you're raised, how you're raised, the circumstances, and some of them can be really good for actually giving you unique artistic channels, abilities, like the ability to create, right? Like trauma and hard circumstances can actually be really good for that. But on the flip side, it messes you up and you get other consequences out of that. And then when you're growing up in those circumstances where you don't have a lot of money or a lot of access to things, the infrastructure isn't there, the dream isn't there. It's hard to find the time. Like you're hand to mouth, man. Like you're trying to just put food on the table. You're trying to look after your mom or your dad or your siblings, or whatever it is, and then what are you supposed to do? Like carve out 2 or 3 hours a day to work on your passion project? That can be hard, especially if
yeah,
you're working multiple jobs just to keep a roof over your head, right? That's a very real challenge. And so I think people who are find themselves in those situations are exactly the right people to be creating art because of their circumstances and what they come out of and their experiences growing up, which are so rich and unique, but also don't really have the space to do it, right?
yeah,
In a certain way, right? So
yeah. I mean, you've lived the real life hustle, like the proper. This isn't a
yeah.
movie. You live the real life hustle. Do you want to share any tips, for listeners who are in the situation
Well,
that you was once in, on what they can do for themselves?
what I mean, there's some basic stuff, and then there's longer stuff, right? Like I think um, one thing that's remained true for me is that I knew as early as 12 that I wanted to write, and I never gave up on that. But I also balanced that with probably a bit of pragmatism, which is I still need to keep a roof over my head. I need to make income. Like I need to, when I had kids, eventually I got to feed my kids. And I knew the realities of pursuing arts in Canada, right? Which is it's just it's very very difficult to get yourself into a comfortable situation financially. So I kind of went at it a couple of ways. One, I approached life with curiosity and desire to get to know people and really get along with people. That doesn't mean I'm a pushover, but I generally like to get along with people. I'm curious about them and I make connections, and those connections have served me well both artistically as well as professionally in my life. Like it's easy to think about structures and applying for jobs and I need this degree or that certificate or this type of a website or this many followers on my social media. It's life isn't about that. Life is ultimately about, the people that you meet along the way and how you help one another out. And so if you keep that as your North Star in this world, that ultimately it's about helping and serving others and establishing really meaningful relationships, then you will find your way professionally, artistically, both, whatever that is. And then the second thing is like a work ethic that it falls on to basic discipline, right? Like I found, like as I got older and as my day job career progressed, where like it was busier and busier and busier, if I wanted to get to my art, I had to cut out other things in my life that were not productive. And so that's like I don't really drink anymore. I drank a lot when I was younger, in my late teens, in my early 20s, probably entirely too much. I really don't drink anymore because, like if I have more than one or two, then like I'm not writing that day. I'm not going to be working my thing. I'm not going to feel good, right? And so, and the same goes with my health. Like I make sure I sleep well as best I can and exercising and things like that, just to keep my energy levels up so that I can bring myself to this job every day, bring myself for my kids, and then find some time here and there with writing. The last thing I'd say is like, don't beat the hell out of yourself if you're not, immediately a success. You should never be into art, I think, or push or pursue art as though you need to have so much income, so many followers, so many positive reviews, whatever your metric is, as a justification to keep producing. I think if you're going to produce art, you have to just accept and be the type of person that says, whether or not anybody reads, like in my case, my gibberish, I'm going to keep writing whether or not anybody reads it. Like it doesn't matter to me whether or not I make any money with it. I'm gonna keep writing. I'm gonna keep getting better at my craft, and I'm gonna keep putting stuff out there however I can, traditionally, self-publish, indie publish, whatever that is. And then come what may. And if I find success with it, then great. But I don't attach any of my self-worth or value as an artist to the reviews that I would get on the internet. They're nice when they come in, but for every good one, there's probably a bad one too. And so, I do that mostly almost out of self-preservation, right? Where if you get too hung up on metrics of success that you see from other people, that's just a hard way to live. So yeah, that's my long rambling diatribe on what little I've learned in the last number of years.
Yeah, I mean, moral of the story is don't focus on vanity metrics. It doesn't define,
you
your
said
work.
it better than me. Yeah,
what you become. And the unfortunate truth is, especially like with your Gen Zs today, who are awesome creators in any form or way, they're so focused on vanity metrics. Okay, if I publish this and I don't even get about 10 likes, I'm giving up. It's over for me. It's done. But there's so many other ways, that you can measure your work, and there's so many other metrics that are taken into consideration now with the World Wide Web. My podcast, for example, has made so much progress, but it's not even based on vanity metrics. I post on social media, on certain platforms, just to keep a presence. That's all it's there for. Just to keep a presence and look, it's there. But the fact that you and I are having an international conversation at this moment has nothing to do with vanity metrics or the fact that 1 million people have liked my post. Nothing at all. Nothing at all. Thanks for sharing it. Much appreciated. That's tips that up and coming, authors can actually take to heart and, use in their own life.
I think you nailed it. You said it better and more succinctly than I did.
No, we're in sync on that, and I'm in agreement with you with all that you just said, don't be hard on yourself and just keep pushing our content, Same thing that I say to independent musicians out there is that if you put the first track out there and it doesn't do well, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't put the next one out there. Just keep putting it out. Keep putting it out. Keep putting it out. Keep building your portfolio. Keep building your catalog. Sooner or later, someone is going to see it and be like, okay, cool, and also understand, the importance of data. Look at where the data is so important. The thing is sometimes because, for example, I'm based in South Africa, I'm looking at the data in South Africa and it's like, only one person is actually checking out, my content. But then if I go and I look deeper and I look at all the tools available to me, for example, as a musician, if I'm looking at Spotify for artists now, it's showing, look, yo, in the US, I got like 1,000 people listening to my music.
Yeah,
So there's people out there. Let me focus on those people. Thanks
that's
for
right.
sharing that.
Yeah, yeah,
Do you want to touch a bit on your journalism career and what
yeah.
exactly you focused on?
What? So ask that question again, just so I understand correctly what you want. What do you want to know? I can dive into it.
Like journalism, like why journalism?
Okay, so why journalism? Well, when I figured initially that it might lead to publishing and writing, but it didn't. And what ended up happening was I went to school, I got my degree in journalism, and like a lot of people in Canada, I initially fell into community news. So you're working for your local newspaper, you're covering City Hall, you're covering local issues, that kind of stuff. But I didn't really enjoy it, which is ironic now, given what I do for a living. But what I found, what happened was I landed ass backwards in Vancouver, and I got a job as a business journalist. And they handed me this portfolio that I knew nothing about, which was all about mining, forestry, oil and gas, fisheries issues. So it was all natural resource industries. And I said to them, I'm like, I don't know anything about natural resource industries. And they said, well, you'll figure it out. I said, okay. So I dove into it, and what I discovered as a writer was that those issues are global. They're not just British Columbia or Canada issues. They weren't just Vancouver issues. I was able to write about platinum mining in South Africa and how that impacted the communities down there and the people and the benefits. And they came out of the Bushveld complex, right? Like those were, or diamond mining in Central Africa, and or takeovers in the DRC and nationalization of resources in Angola and other places like that. And so for me, it became an escapist adventure. To be honest with you, as a journalist, I was able to cover really important global issues that impacted everybody around the world, but I could do it from a desk in Vancouver. And what ended up happening was Canada, I think similar to South Africa, though bigger geographically, outside of the major cities, natural resources is what drives the economy. And so I started going up north where I live now to like forestry complexes, like mills, mines, oil and gas plants, and doing stories on the ground around what was being built and how it was impacting the people, both good and bad. And I fell in love with that. And it was like this everyday adventure of really complex stuff. I think it appealed to me intellectually. It had a political component to it because its natural resource extraction is so political and so critical to governments everywhere. And you really get to understand how the world works when you cover the commodity sector broadly. And then I fell in love with small towns along the way. And then that was eventually, after I'd done that for a little while, that was how I ended up making the decision to move out of Vancouver into northern BC, which most people thought was nuts. Why would you trade winter for more winter? But I did, and I never looked back. And I love living up in smaller rural areas, focusing on rural issues. So yeah, that was kind of journalism for me. It didn't turn into me becoming an author. It didn't really help with the fiction side, but I will say, like, it did help giving me a lot of confidence in learning quickly and creating in an environment where you don't know a lot. And that's an important skill set that I use to this day.
Yeah. Out of curiosity, coming from someone who studied journalism and worked, in the sector, mainstream media these days is criticized a lot.
Yeah,
Criticized a lot. Are we really getting the correct news? So we're just getting a version that's passed down from someone and what they want the masses to actually, know, but it's not actually, the truth. And also the red tape that's involved. How
yeah.
much truth is the masses actually getting on a specific topic?
Well, I guess I'd go back and approach the question this way. Back when I was reporting, it was during the first period of time when the media was really kind of getting turned upside down by the internet, and we were starting to see the consolidation of the various media outlets. And what I found at the time was that, by and large, the mainstream media traditional media is what we'll call it. So your big city newspapers and your big city broadcasters, they were structured from a business model perspective that they did not have enough space to go into depth on any one issue. So if you picked up an old broadsheet newspaper, whether it would be in Pretoria or Durban or Johannesburg or Cape Town, wherever it was, you're more likely to find a story in there with a headline, but the story would be short. It really wouldn't give you a lot of background or context. And then what happened was that over time, you got a bunch of reporters who were generalists. So back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, you had more journalists that were really in depth on one topic. And as the fiscal position in the media in the Western hemisphere, that's where I come from in North America, changed, the businesses stopped investing in editorial. So you would say, well, we can't have as many specialist journalists, so we're going to have fewer journalists. And when you have fewer journalists spread over more news, you get more shallow news. So it wasn't so much that there was this sort of concerted effort to not tell the public what was going on. It's that you had fewer and fewer people covering more and more issues more shallowly. And so that created a vacuum of knowledge and information, and nobody was providing background, in-depth context on any of these issues, whatever they might be, geopolitical, social stuff, economic stuff, conflict-related things. And then at the same time, there's this perfect storm of the internet coming in, and then podcasters, bloggers, and other folks who said, well, hold on, journalism isn't a professionally regulated profession. Anybody can be a journalist. I'm going to just start digging up data and flooding the internet with it, and I'm going to get a following. Now, that worked for a while when you had a relatively well-structured mainstream media that was still resourced, and then you had internet sleuths, for a lack of a better term. Between the two of them, you could get a sense of what was actually going on out there. But fast forward to 2025, in the Canadian context, there's very little mainstream media left. It's consolidated into one or two companies. They don't have the time to be going into depth really around anything. So their content is extraordinarily superficial and very limited. Most of the really good journalists who used to be into it have gone into either public relations and communications. So they're now on the other side, specifically advancing a message, using those skill set to advance a message for being paid for by hire by someone. So they're very skilled operators to advance a particular worldview, whatever the issue is, wherever they're working. So you've got all these people in the communications industry now, which has just gotten absolutely massive and influences our politics and what we see. And then you have the internet sleuths down here that have emerged and appeal to specific audiences. One of the things that mainstream media used to do is, in the absence of the internet, you only had so many places you could get news. So you and I would be getting news from the same place. We would know generally the same facts, and then maybe we'd have some hearsay. But now you and I are getting entirely different news from entirely different sources with entirely different information, which may or may not be vetted. And so you and I can enter into a conversation. We can say, what happened in Egypt today? Well, depending on where I got my information, where you got your information, we're in totally different worlds, and it keeps spreading. And so that's the problem. I don't think we ask the question, is the mainstream media giving us what's accurate? The mainstream media is largely giving us what it is able to produce under the conditions that it has and the information it has access to in a very short period of time. They're not paid well. They're not getting the best skill set of journalists that they would have had 20 or 30 years ago. So there's also some naivety that is playing into how you're seeing the news absorbed and then pushed out. And the worst part about it, just to finish off, is that it actually is worse in rural and small towns than it is in big city centers. Big city centers were able to maintain their broadcasters and their newspapers in Canada largely. But in the smaller centers, we pretty much have lost all of our local newspapers, or what would have passed for a local newspaper way back in the day, which means there's a news desert or a news vacuum now that's occurring in rural issues. And so those rural issues, to take that one step further, where is all this anger coming from in Canada and the US at a political level. I can tell you it's not coming out of the urban areas by and large. A lot of it is really coming out of rural areas where people have lost jobs over the last 10, 20, 30 years. They have no labor mobility. They don't have access to doctors, all those various things. With no media to cover that, those issues don't hit the big city. So the country itself doesn't understand why there's this divide between urban and rural areas. So there's another long-winded diatribe for you, just on my assessment of, at least I think in a Canadian context, what's happened by and large.
Yeah, no, thanks for elaborating on that. You know what's like, if I look at my local media, my local newspaper, it's always negative. You know, there's
Yeah,
never anything that's published to say, okay, you know what, this is happening in the area, which is bringing so much
yep,
opportunities and so much growth. It's always negative, which is why I love what is happening with the internet at the moment, and
yep.
it is why I love what's happening with podcasts at the moment, because now you can actually jump onto a podcast, get proper news on a topic, and you're going to get positivity out of it as well.
Yeah, you
Unlike
do.
the newspaper that's still in black and white, and it's negative this, negative that, this happened, that happened,
Yep.
you know?
Yeah, and a lot of that comes from, at least again in the Canadian context, what I often saw was that a young journalist or an inexperienced journalist will often mistake being a contrarian for being sort of hitting another level of professionalism, right? So they'll automatically look for, well, what's the conflict, angle on this story, whatever it is, and try and zero in on the conflict portion or create conflict in there or highlight conflict bigger than it actually is in whatever issue as a way to position themselves as separate from the issue, objective from the issue, and then therefore, this is contrarian. Oh, but did you know this? Did you know that this little thing is happening over here? Because the problem that you have in the culture of journalism in North America was that if you wrote a positive story, people said, you're a hack for that company or that government or whatever it is.
Yeah,
And it's like, well, that's actually not the case. How come when you write a negative story, you're not a hack on the other side then, right? Like
yeah,
that's
yeah,
not actually what it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be objective facts. And so you end up with this culture, I think, in the media where in that mainstream side where you're always chasing the negativity. And then structurally in editorial departments, it actually feeds itself because the most controversial story or the one that's going to get the most eyes is typically the one that would go on the front page or it would be at the top of the news hour. And so if you're sending that message as an editor to your journalists that you will only win this daily race with your competition and your colleagues by coming up with the most salacious, controversial, conflict, negative story that you can. That's how you get on the front page. That is an incentive to now create that type of content.
yeah,
And so that culturally is problematic. It serves well in an environment of media where there is many media outlets with lots of checks and balances, lots of competition, and they're well funded. It does not serve well in an environment where fiscally where we are today, where you're under-resourced, understaffed, underexperienced, and your fiscal picture is quite ugly. It becomes a race to the bottom. And then to your point, that creates space for other creators to come in and focus on other things who aren't bound by those regulations that a mainstream journalist might be. So a podcast or a blogger or whatever that might be.
yeah. And fear sells most.
Fear sells most. It always has, right? It's kind of funny. I used to say to people, they say, why do you guys always write so negative in the news? And I say, well, let me ask you this. When you go down to the pub with your buddies and you sit down and have over a beer and you haven't seen these guys for 4 or 5 days and you start chatting, is anybody telling you about how great their workout was or how lovely
Yeah,
their marriage is or how great their job is? No,
yeah.
you guys are all naturally talking about your marriage sucks. You don't want to work hard. Your boss is an idiot, and the prime minister is a moron, right? And so I do think it's easy to blame media and journalists and everything, but I think it's also human nature when we're together and we talk. We tend to focus on the stuff that makes us laugh, which is often negative, right? And we like to critique. We like to like have arguments and debate about things, right? And I think the media is or was sort of a version of that pub conversation writ large.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we've spent a good 30 minutes getting to know you well, and also, touching on a topic that's extremely important because, I try to do my best as I can to get people away from, especially like in my local community, away from, the local media and just focus on, podcasts, focus on
Yeah,
platforms such as Medium, read those type of blogs, get like this broader understanding about the world that it's like yesterday again, referencing back to the podcast I was on, I said like the world is disastrous. But then I had to also say, look, as much as I've mentioned disasters, the world is
yeah,
a beautiful place.
it
It's
is.
just the information that we consume that's making, certain situations so disastrous.
It is. Yeah, I think you nailed it there. It's almost at times like there's two realities. There's the digital reality and how planet Earth looks if you were only looking at it through media and social media lens. And then there's what we experience every day when we just run into one another in our communities. And one of the things
Yeah.
I've been telling myself is to ignore the former and focus more on the latter just to maintain positive mindset going forward.
Yeah, 100%, 100%. So let's touch on your books and correct me if I'm wrong. You have two books at the
Yeah,
moment. That's good. Two books. Okay. Wolf at the Door. Let's start there. That's your previous book. Let's
yeah.
start there and then, we can transition into your latest book, which is also an award winning book.
Yeah, for sure. So Wolf at the Door is a novella. It's a werewolf creature comedy horror. And it's a two-act story, and I got the idea for it really during the first wave of COVID, as so many of us creators did, which is the theme of the story is really, what happens when people with first world problems suddenly end up with real world problems. And so the first half of that book is a dinner party over Thanksgiving, which in Canada is in October, with a bunch of family members and extended family who really don't like one another and have all kinds of issues with it. And so the first part of the book is really this dinner party that just is disastrous. Like it's awful. And then the werewolves show up. And then they all have to figure out and after everything is blown up socially amongst themselves, how do we survive the night with werewolves that are trying to get into our house and rip us apart? And so that's where you transition from first world problems to real world problems, which was kind of what was going through my mind during that first phase of COVID. So it's a short book. It's a lot of fun. It's meant to be tongue in cheek. It's meant to be funny. And it is gruesome at times when the werewolves show up. There's no question about that. It does lean into its creature horror origins.
Yeah, yeah. So how long exactly is the book? You
That's
mentioned
about
about short.
125 pages. You can devour that bad boy in a few hours.
Yeah. It's crazy how you can mix comedy with horror. There's a werewolf
Yeah,
attack, but
yeah,
there's still.
they work. I don't know why, but it kind of works. It's a weird alchemy.
Yeah, yeah. So what's your approach when you start with these storylines, Like what's the creative process like behind it?
It's different every time. Sometimes I'm not much of a planner. So I found in the past when I plan out books or stories, I get bored of them before I even start writing them. So
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I am a person who does it by what we call a pantser, so by the seat of your pants. But that's not to say that I'm not thinking and plotting and planning as I go along. So with Wolf at the Door, I knew I got the concept in my head around what I wanted to do. And what I was, as a creator, what I was really trying to figure out was how to write conflict between people in that book and get better at that. And so that's what that first part of the book is about is just the conflict that comes from that dinner party. And the extent to which I did planning was I knew that it was going to be two acts, and I knew roughly how it was going to end. And I knew that it started at the dinner table, and I knew that it only took place in the house. So it was time and space limited, and that allowed me to keep the story tight. Like you can't really go beyond those boundaries or that period of time. And a werewolf is nice as your antagonizing force because by dawn it's no longer a werewolf. So now you're into a tighter structured story, which was what I was looking to do because I have a tendency to write long at times. And then the where I did do the planning on that one was I actually did plan out the seating arrangements at the dinner party. And so I actually drew a table and have my cast of characters, and I knew who hated one another and who didn't. And all the people that didn't get along, I sat them next to one another. And then as I wrote it, I just kind of let the conversation play out as I thought it would, and lo and behold, it blew up. Every corner of the table blows up in its own way, right?
Yeah.
Until the whole thing goes totally sideways. So that's how I planned it out, and then the rest of it, it was actually natural. Once the dinner party blew up, it was easy then to just cascade into the rest of the story, which is how do we survive the night? And then as people get slowly picked off, who's left, how do they survive it? That was relatively easy.
Yeah. Not to give too much away, because of course, we want people to
Yeah,
purchase and read the book. But like the
yeah.
werewolves themselves, are they linked like bloodline to the family at the table?
No,
Not at all.
no, not at all. Not at all.
No,
They
no.
are linked socially, but they're not members of the family.
Yeah. No, in my mind I was like, okay, you know what? When the werewolf actually turns back, it's actually like, a long distance family member.
Yeah, yep,
you know. Okay. So your second book. So
yeah.
okay, first, how long does it exactly take you to write a book? Like, what's your average time?
It depends. Wolf at the Door, because it's relatively short. I wrote that in about 3 weeks, and I
Wow.
was pushing through,
Yeah.
so that one was quick. I've got a fantasy novel that is forthcoming later this year, and that took me about 100,000 words, and the initial draft of it took me about 2 months. And I worked really fast on that, really, really fast. And then about a year ago, I finished another novel of horror. Neither of these two novels are out yet. I'm still going through edits, and that took me a year. It took me a year to write that one. That's about 130,000 words. So it really depends on the project. I have been fortunate in times to crack out, short stories in like a matter of hours if it really hits me. But usually a short story, it's going to be a matter of days. It's going to take me a few days to actually write one, 2 or 3 days, and then I can get one out. And then longer stuff, it really depends on work schedule, and then whether or not I've really got it figured out. I've had multiple stuff too where I've gotten into it like 30, 40,000 words, and it's just not working, and I have to set it aside, and then that's it, right? That happens too.
Okay, so it came from the trees. That's your
Yep.
latest book that's out. So let's touch on that.
Yeah, It Came from the Trees is different. So it's a collection of 5 stories. And it is very specifically designed to be like a spin rack, pulpy fiction read like you would have found in your local corner store in the 1980s or the 90s. So 5 stories, mostly horror. There's one hard science fiction thriller in there, and then there's a dark fantasy one in there as well. So they're a mix. It's a potpourri on purpose. And it's got illustrations in for every story as well, which is something I also wanted to do. I really wanted to do a throwback to those types of pulpy kind of escapist creature horror or spooky stories that you would have found in the 80s and 90s from an author you've never heard of. And so that one, it's overall short. There's a novelette is the titler story. It Came from the Trees, and it starts off that way. And the other 4 are all relatively short. So it's clocking in at around the same length as Wolf of the Door, about 130 pages-ish that you can get through it, which I also like. I love anthologies, but anthologies are also hard to read. So I thought a shorter anthology might actually be a little bit more accessible. So yeah, that's It Came from the Trees. That one actually took me. I didn't intend to release it when I wrote all the stories initially. They just kind of it worked really well, and so that was why that all eventually came together and became my second release.
And you've also won an award for this specific book as well.
Yeah. So Wolf at the Door won a gold in horror from the Global Books, and It Came from the Trees won a bronze for in the short story collection from the Global Book Awards. So yeah, I've been surprisingly. It's nice to get the kudos. That's good currency
Yeah,
to
yeah.
keep trading on.
And with these awards, sorry, out of curiosity, like what are the metrics actually?
I have no idea. Uh,
Yeah,
I have no idea. You apply for these things and submit and hope you're going to get recognized, and sometimes you do, and sometimes you don't. And it's, I always think of it as just two things. One, it's a bit of a confidence booster for us writers who are often
yeah,
alone doing this stuff at odd hours of the day, and nobody understands why we're doing it or maybe even reads it. So it's nice to get some kudos that keeps you going as an artist. And then secondly, I think it is something, it's currency. An award, no matter what the award is, it's currency you can trade on, you can use as part of your marketing to get your name back out there, to publish more, to sell more, right? And ultimately selling more is about giving yourself more freedom in your life to create more. So that's really how I see those two things, confidence and currency.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Man, I have to ask, and this is now, going back to the start of the conversation with you stating, you are a full-time job. How do you manage it all? You also mentioned, you ensure that you get enough sleep, you get exercise. How do you manage it all? You know?
Um, I think as a journalist, I got really used to, maximizing your time because you were always working under deadline and had a lot to produce every day. So I'm really used to that like I can fit a lot into an 8 or 9 hour day. Like there's very few wasted minutes. So I work hard, and I focus on my work and I get my stuff done. But people say, because I've been asked this question a number of times, there's no such thing as balance. Like there just isn't. You're going to have periods of time in your life where you're just solely focused on work, and it's going to come at the expense of your family or social things. And then you're going to have time where you're going to have to create time where it's the other way, where you focus on your family, you focus on yourself. And you hope over a longer period of time that it balances itself out. It doesn't balance every day, but maybe over 6 months, a year and a half, you can look back and say, yeah, actually, pretty good balance there. I was able to move a bunch of things forward. In terms of my writing, I will usually when I'm creating, it's in the evenings when the kids are kind of already they're squared away, they're entertaining themselves. I'll go down and I'll sit down and I'll just say, hey, I only want 2 sentences. I'll write 2 sentences. And sometimes that turns into 10, 12, 100 sentences, and I keep going for a half hour, an hour. Sometimes it's two.
Yeah,
And I don't beat myself up about that. I don't worry about it being a good 2 sentences. I just worry about forward momentum. And if I don't get to it for a few days, I also don't worry about that. Like I've got a lot going on because I've got obviously my day job and I've got young daughters. And so the writing right now is something that I focused on, and I set goals every year and I try to achieve them. But I don't kill myself if I slip up on a goal, because the
yeah.
hope is that I'll get good enough at my craft that by the time I'm older and have more space in my life, then I'll really lean into it, and then it'll hopefully take off.
Look, I mean, as a creator, just because you're doing more doesn't mean you're going to achieve more.
No,
Sometimes when you step away, from
yep,
your creative work for about a week or so, that's when your best creativity is actually going to come to
yep,
light.
yep.
You know,
Yeah, I totally
so
agree with that.
yeah,
You can't you don't want to exhaust the sort of the well of creativity. Like I often people say, like even just laying around, well, that's writing too. Because
yeah,
I'm thinking about something, right? Like something's going through my head, and it might be good, it might not be good, but that's all part of the process as well. So I'm sure it is for you, like especially around music and stuff. Like it's kind of always hanging out there, and then when you get something, you're like, okay, I'm gonna sit down, I'm gonna create, right? So it's a balance
yeah.
between good habits and discipline, and also like freedom to create when it's right, and to not when it's not working for you.
It's like if you have writer's block, right?
Mm-hmm.
Don't overthink it in the moment, and tell yourself, okay, I have to figure this out now. I have to figure this out now. I am not going to sleep until I figure it out. Leave it where it's at. Give
Yeah.
yourself some time. Give yourself, a day or two, and it's going to come to you. It's going to
It
come
will.
to you. Yeah,
Yep.
that's what
Yep. It's
that's what
yep.
I need to get down next. That's how it
Yep.
happens. That's
It
honestly
is
how it
how it
happens.
happens. Yeah, it
Give
happens
yourself
that
some time
way.
out space.
Yep. I was gonna say it's a bit like trying to beat a level in a hard video game. Like you keep going against this boss and you'll die and you'll die and you'll die and then you get frustrated and then you'll die 20 or 30 times and then you're like, okay, I'm turning it off. You go back to it the next day, you beat the guy the first time and you're like, why was that so hard? And
Yeah,
it's the same thing, right? Like sometimes you just have to your point, you got to step away from it and then somehow it all kind of gels in a day or two, right?
yeah, no, 100%. So tell me something. Are you self-published?
Yes, both traditionally and self.
Okay, how's that working out?
It's good. I like the self-publishing. It works really well for me right now with where I'm at in my career, and the channels exist to do it really, really well, and retain creative control, marketing control, and all those things in a way that you can't when you're working with a traditional publisher. It's particularly nice when you're starting out because when you're starting out, you're not going to get a lot of interest from publishers. Even if they pick you up, like there's probably not a lot of marketing dollars going into it anyway. So you can launch yourself, but make no mistake, you have to treat it like a business. There's the creative side of this business, which is what you and I have been talking about in that creative pathway. But the moment at which you have decided now I'm going to publish, now it's a business. And you
Yeah,
need to approach that as a business and you need to take it seriously. Don't approach it as an artist, because that is where you'll fall down and frustrate yourself. And realize, back to your points, you have to keep producing. So you do have to keep getting things out there. You got to build your brand over time. And so you're selling a product, right? And so yeah, your first book might not be huge, or maybe your first one is good, but your second one is a flop. That doesn't matter. You just keep going. You keep building that awareness. For me, because I've been published a lot in journalism, and had my name out there quite a bit on that side of things, I didn't see traditional publishing as I need that for my own to like justify my existence as a writer. I've been writing professionally, been published for many, many years. So I do a hybrid of self-publishing when I think it makes sense for the work, and then traditional publishing with publishers when it makes sense for that work. And so I'm on both sides of that fence, and I think a lot more artists are these days. And I think it works well too, because I think on one side it shows, hey, actually there are other people here who are willing to publish my work, and it validates yourself as an artist. But also it shows that entrepreneurial side. Hey, I'm going to also get my art out the way I want, and here's another way to find it, right?
yeah, 100%. And editors, you work with editors?
All the time, always. Yeah, yeah. Both developmental editors and copy editors. So I'll always try and clean something up as best I can, but like you can't see all your own mistakes. So you really do need. I recommend that before you ever self-publish. Get another set of eyes on it, professional eyes. It's worth the time. It's worth the money. Because once that work is out there, you really do want it to be the best version of it that it can be.
Yeah. And this is a common question I always ask authors, at the end of the show is what is your take on artificial intelligence at the moment?
Yeah, that's a good question. I have a couple of takes on it. I think on the one side, as an artist, I'm always trying to work with, when it comes to art, original art and illustrators, and not use AI. But on the other side of it, I also know from like a business and economics perspective, that cat's out of the bag and it's not going back in. And
Yeah,
so, and so I think it's largely a wasted effort to try and say AI should disappear. It's not going to disappear. It's only going to grow. And I think as artists, we need to be willing to accept that, and b eventually look and see, well, where actually is it valuable. The tough part is with it, that anytime you're using it, you are potentially, you have the impact of does that coming out of another artist's mouth, right? So if I'm using AI, like, am I actually taking away work from another artist? And that's a tough question to answer. I think that's where we're at right now is trying to figure out the morals behind the tech. But the tech isn't going anywhere. It's only getting bigger. And it does make artistic creation far more accessible than it ever has been before.
Yeah.
So there is a part of me, a tiny little part of me, that's kind of excited about where it leads. And I know that puts me at odds with most artists on AI these days, but I've never claimed to share everybody else's opinion on stuff. So that's kind of where I land.
Yeah. For up and coming artists, I mean, right now they just so overwhelmed about it, on whether or not I should actually pursue, with my authenticity, like my authentic work, because now anyone can just jump onto one of these platforms and create an ebook in 5 minutes, and they can put it on Amazon and then they can sell it. So, should I actually pursue, you know, my career, my dream of
Yeah,
writing,
yeah,
you know? So,
yeah, yeah. And like it's like anything, right? Like I think what you wouldn't want to do is embrace AI to help you create at the expense of developing your own craft and voice, whatever that art is. So there still has to be an art. Otherwise, we should just have AI create everything for us. There has to be the human in there, and the human in there is the one that is ultimately influencing what is created. And the best way to influence that is to develop your own voice, and that is by honing your craft over time, right? So if you're just only ever using AI, but you're not adding value as you as the artist to that and influencing ultimately what comes out, then I don't know that it's a useful exercise to advance an artistic career. I think that perhaps it can be eventually something that is like an add-on or catalyzes it a bit, but I still think you really like as a writer. Um, I mean, get really good at writing before you start using AI would be probably where I would land. And the other thing with it is like I wouldn't use AI for writing because then what's the point, right? I'm not a writer anymore, So like actually for me, it's the process of creation that is the valuable piece. It's not just seeing my name out there published, like that's vanity, right? That's the business side of it. It's actually the process of creating that is really really powerful. And if you're taking that away from yourself, you're robbing yourself of that rich artistic experience that is hard to learn and
100%.
get good at something.
100%. Do you see in the future to come, as AI gets more advanced, of using AI to actually be your editor? So
Oh,
I can still write, but use AI to actually edit my work.
um, AI can already, I think, probably really effectively edit at a copy level. Developmentally, I think it is probably would really struggle. But yeah, I mean, it's probably a year or two away from being, arguably as good of a developmental editor as a person. I will stay away from that for now, just because, hey, I'm trying to support other artists. So that's kind of where I land. But I have to say, it's a for now comment. Things might change where suddenly that tech has changed, the artistic community has changed, and you find yourself in a position where it's like, yeah, actually that might be the right way to go for this or for that. You never know. I mean, media outlets way back in the '90s refused to put their news online, right? We're not going to do that. We're only gonna stay in print form. Well, that didn't work out real well for them. So
Yeah. Now, man, thanks for sharing your opinion on that. So, where can people find you online? Where
you
you
can
at?
find me. Yeah, you can find me on my website, joelmckay.ca. And you can find me on X, Joel C. McKay, or on Instagram and threads at author_Joel_McKay.
I'm just thinking of something now. A few weeks ago, I also asked the author, where can I find you? And he says, you will never find me on X. I don't want to be involved with Nazis.
I've been on there. I've been on there since 2009, and at this point in time, like I don't do much on there other than watch the insanity and watch it
Uh,
evolve every day, and it's evolving every day. But I'm also too
yeah,
lazy to go out and create another channel, so I'm still
yeah.
technically there.
Yeah. Now, I mean, me personally, I'm also on X. I don't use it as much unless I feel like, okay, you know what, I want to share something, it's like a
Yeah,
repost,
yeah,
not really new content from me.
yeah,
But, I just love each and every single week interacting with different people that just, make me laugh on a specific topic or
yeah,
platform.
yeah. Everybody's got an opinion. Yeah, and I gotta tell you, mine is I don't really care. I'm just gonna keep doing my thing and ignore
That's
everybody
it.
else.
That's it. Do your thing. Do you use whatever platform you feel comfortable with,
Yeah,
and run with it. Run with it.
yeah,
Joel,
you got
thank
it.
you so much for your time. This was really insightful. I mean, from getting to know you in the first 30 minutes, sharing your background of journalism and where, that's standing at the moment in 2025, and with your books and your creative process. And I wish you all the best and many more awards to come.
Thanks, Kino. It was a pleasure talking with you, man. Look after yourself, eh?
You too as well. Just one more thing before you go. You do
Yeah,
say you have, another book that will be released soon. Any specific date you want to tie that down to?
August. Look for it in
August.
August. Yeah, young adult fantasy coming out in August. So there you go.
Perfect. Thank you
Thanks,
so
man.
much. Thank you so
Yeah,
much. And please enjoy the rest of your day, man.
yeah. You too. Have a good evening.
All right. Cheers, brother. Bye.